Hello, everyone. How are y'all doing?
Super good. I'm really excited to be here. It's looking forward to a new year of everything in New Year Bible Study Live.
Yeah, same. Really excited.
That's cool. I was like, Peter, I think you said while we were at conference, yeah, and Bible Study Life is next week. And I'm like, oh my, everything really?
Yeah, it snuck up on us a little bit, didn't it?
Yep. We were totally scrambling. I'm gonna be super honest here. Melody and I were talking with each other and texting while we were flying back from Albuquerque to our homes, saying, "Hey, what passage should we do?" It's pretty good. Hi, everyone. I see a lot of hellos. I'm so happy to see everyone. If this is your first time, welcome to Bible Study Live, where we are just grabbing a random passage from the Bible and kind of discussing it together. Of course, since we are all trans or gender expensive people, we are viewing scripture a little bit different. So what I've been enjoying from the Bible study lives that I've seen so far and the Bible study lives that I've participated in is that opening it up like that really gives room for different interpretations. And also, I feel like in this space, nobody is the expert. We just have this collaborative exploration together. And at least I finish these Bible studies live feeling all the richer. So I'm excited to get us going. This week, we are reading through Philippians 1:27 through 30. And oh, before I forget, if this is also your first time at Bible Study Live, this is a live Bible study. So if you have anything to say, just dump it in the chats. One of us will have a look at it and we will try to answer the questions. Again, we're not experts, we're just doing this together. So I'm just going to go ahead and read the passage
Oh,
and
before
then
sorry, before we get do we want to just quickly share our names and pronouns for folks who might be joining us for the first time?
that is a good idea. Do you want to start,
I
Melody?
can start. Hello, everyone. My name is Micah Melody. You can call me Micah or Melody or Micah Melody. My pronouns are she, her, hers, and I am the director of community engagement here at EMC.
And I'm Peter. My pronouns are they, them, and I am the Development and Communications Coordinator here at TMC.
And we love you for that. My name is Mish Van Essen, and I'm the Director of Operations here at TMC. I'm the latest addition and am so excited still to work here. Okay, then now let's go dig in. Let's first read. I think Philippians has brought a lot of emotions up in us. So let me just read the text for us, and then we will, before we dig in, we want to share something about this. So first, gonna take a sip. Philippians 1:27. I am reading controversially from the ESV because that's the Bible that I had here. Just one thing. As citizens of heaven, live your life worthy of the gospel of Christ. Then, whether I come and see you or am absent, I will hear about you that you are standing firm in one spirit, in one accord, contending together for the faith of the gospel, not being frightened in any way by your opponents. This is a sign of destruction for them, but of your salvation. And this is from God, for it has been granted to you on Christ's behalf not only to believe in him, but also to suffer for him, since you are engaged in the same struggle that you saw I had, and now hear that I have. Ooh, um, we had a small little conversation before we got started, and this used to be one of my favorite passages. I think this chapter is one of the greatest hits in the Bible. But uh, Peter and Melody, are you? What were you thinking when you read this for the first time in a while again?
I mean, I have to say I had a really negative reaction to I was telling you both I read through the entire chapter just to give some context when I was just preparing for this today. And yeah, there are several parts of this chapter, and then including these verses that we're going to be focusing on, that really kind of triggered some uncomfortable things in me, some memories of how some of these ideas and some of this theology has been used in my experience in certain church contexts to harm people, um, and to, suppress sort of differences. So I think that was my immediate response, was definitely like discomfort, and yeah, just was a little bit of a negative one.
Yes.
Yeah, same here. When I first kind of read this, I had this kind of like gut feeling of just like of a sinking feeling in my gut. Specifically, conduct yourself worthy of the gospel, as one worthy of the gospel, right? And the ways that that has been used against me and against queer folks in general,
Mhm.
of this exclusion of conduct yourself and be pure, and this kind of way that that language is used against LGBTQ people. And I also similarly had a gut reaction of just oof. Um, but also, like, looking at this a little deeper, there are things that I feel a lot of hope in this. And similarly, I used to love this passage. To like similarly to you, Misha, like this passage like used to be a favorite for me. I used to come back to this. I had part of it like memorized growing up.
Mhm.
Um, but absolutely, it's definitely it's a complicated thing now. And I wanted to acknowledge that specifically to other people too who might be here. If I don't know, I'm curious for other people who are in the chat. What is like coming up for you? Is there any way that this might be bringing up things, or how do you feel about as we read these kind of things together? And one of the things I love about what we get to do together on Bible Study Live is sometimes wrestle with some of these things that might be complicated and see what kind of new hope or life that we can kind of bring into things that might have been potentially harmful at one time for us as queer folks.
Right. Yes, totally with you too. Because when I was on the plane and suggested this passage, like chapter one, I don't know if this went for you as well. I just jumped to this one. This was one of the passages, this letter and this passage I've written most about in my early theology days. So I was like, sure, sure, we can do something about this. But then when I read it, I'm like, oh, I haven't read this passage since I came out. It's just a little over 2.5 years ago. So it hit a little bit different. I agree with the wording, especially the suffering part. I'm
Mhm.
like, wait a second. Like, I can go into the Greek and, beautify some things for me, but the suffering part was like, ah, how do I interpret this? So I am super curious to hear what y'all online think about that, but also Melody and Peter, what you are all thinking. And yes, and it's of course that whole part, and we're gonna get there in a little bit, of standing in one spirit. It just doesn't feel that way. We are so divided in American Christianity, if you will. Um, yeah, it feels like that memo was a little bit missed.
Well, and when is unity something to actually be, you know, desired or like strived for, and when is it something we actually need to avoid,
Yes,
like for its
yes.
own sake?
Yeah. Oof.
Yeah, it's a complicated. These are a complicated few verses.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I see in the chats uh some folks already. Hi Nettle, by the way. I see some people say I struggle with the feelings versus scripture.
Mhm.
With you there. I'm not a fan of Paul in general, but I have to like deal with it every now and then. And then um somebody else says I love 29. When we are solid and firm in our relationship with God, we can stand firm on what we understand as the truth, our unshakableness as proof of our salvation. Wow, that's pretty deep. And then Carolyn says, one thing that I'm noticing with the ESV versus the CEB, how individualistic the ESV sounds, while the
Mhm.
CEB said most important live together. Ooh, I am definitely curious to compare some translations together. To be honest, I was so deep in my theological studies that we had to read everything in Greek. So you kind of like miss the nuance of the gift that translators, or the curse sometimes, that translators give us. So it's kind of refreshing to read this. Um, let's see. Some more comments are coming in. I'm reading this in the context of the experience of the New Testaments, the particular situations of the Philippians. Yes. The community at Philippi, like so many other communities, were beset by conflict and disharmony. Yes. And Jenny says, I'm still seeing the starting soon sign. Has the Bible study started? Yes, it has, but I reckon it doesn't matter if I say this out loud. Out loud. Thanks, Melody, for texting that. All right, so quick background before we move in. Um, you know, letters in the New Testament are often debated by who it's written. However, Philippians is one of those letters that people typically attribute to Paul. Um, there's three locations that scholars think where Paul could have been, because Paul has been in prison three times. However, Paul is mentioning his imminent death. So morbid, of course, but that places this most likely when he was in prison in Rome. And I do like one part of the background, because you got this dude called Epaphroditus, and he's, hey, I'm gonna visit you. We're thinking of you. Remember that church you planted in Europe? Uh, and he just gives him a letter. But then Epaphroditus gets sick and heals, and Paul's like, you know what? I'm gonna write a letter and give it to Epaphroditus, and Epaphroditus will bring it back to the church in Philippi, which we don't know too much about. But that's kind of like the background of what happened. And maybe interesting to share before we get started is that this letter has a very classic Greco-Roman rhetorical style. So it follows the typical style of eloquent letter writing, so fancy. So yes, so let's dig in. Verse 27. Um, so Peter, do you want to read verse 27 one more time and maybe share what you think about it?
Sure. Yeah, I'm reading from the NRSV updated edition. So my 27 kind of cuts off in the middle of a sentence, but I'll finish the sentence, I guess.
Yeah, go for it.
Only live your life in a manner worthy of the gospel of Christ, so that whether I come and see you or am absent and hear about you, I will know that you are standing firm in one spirit, striving side by side with one mind for the faith of the gospel, and in no way frightened by those opposing you. One thing I actually noticed when you read it in your translation, Mish, was one translation difference is I think yours said contending, where mine said striving side by side.
Mm.
And that just seemed so different like in terms of a way to like it just that conveys something totally different to me, because striving side by side sounds to me like we're working together towards a common purpose, and contending has this like combative kind of feel to it, like where like the important thing is what we're like fighting against, as opposed
Hmm.
to the fact that we're like pursuing this goal together. So just right away another like sort of example of the different ways that people kind of the different directions people take this verse.
Yeah,
That seems indicative right there of like the ways that people like choose to interpret this and how they use it.
yeah. I mean, ESV has a lot of problems. Like, for example, ESV translates uh, words like servants when it's when it's about a woman. They translate the same word deacon as servant, diakonos as servant. But when it's a man, they all of a sudden translate it as it's a deacon. So yeah, it's problematic. It's
I
Yeah.
see Carolyn says the CEB says struggle together. Um,
Hmm.
I'm actually reading from the NLT because it captures something that's really interesting. I think you'll appreciate this, Mish. It says, above all, you must live as citizens of heaven,
oh,
conducting
that's
yourself in a manner worthy of the good news about Christ. When regarding kind of that striving, this says fighting together for the faith. So like that's even more aggressive. So that, it's really interesting that the there's all over these like shifts in kind of the choices that people are translators are using.
Hmm.
yeah. That's interesting though. Yeah, Sunat Leo, the word that's there used is definitely competitive in
Yeah,
nature.
like almost
Mm.
athletic competition.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It's like, what does that mean? Like life is a game and we gotta compete in it, but cooperatively, like a cooperative board games, y'all.
Yeah.
It reminds me of the sort of like I have finished the race thing, like
Yes,
this
exactly. It's
and pushing
very it's
yourself.
Yeah, it's very much in that same sort of feel. Paul loves kind of athletic metaphor. And so
Yeah.
Sunathleo is I strive together or I compete together. It's like this kind of pushing forward. Um, and it's really interesting how the nuances get taken and moved in that way. So if you think about it, it could be like, a team sport, so that's kind of how I like to think of that, or a marathon where you're, or like a what's it called, why am I blanking on
Relay
a
race.
relay, thank you, a
Yeah.
relay race.
I saw your face. I'm like, you're trying to say relay race. I got you.
Thank you. I see a couple more things in the chat. Anti Levin said, Paul said we fight not against flesh and blood. This may be in reference to understanding the adversary as principalities. Yes,
Mm.
like using that language of fight there.
Hmm.
um and then Velvet Video, love that name, by the way.
Same.
Fight for seems more collaborative. I like,
Mm.
yeah. Um, and then I see Lizzie is I don't see, it says the NRSV. I think it got cut off there, Lizzie.
There it is. Oh no, there it's not. Yeah.
But while we're kind of like thinking about that, I'd love to just, one thing that I'm really curious about is the first part. Um, Kind of the live your life in a manner worthy of the gospel of Christ, which I think was the thing that really brought up that tension in me initially. I'm curious what you all think of that. And like we've already noticed that there's a little translation difference here in the NLT, but I'm curious.
Yeah. I mean, you saw it in my notes, and I already am happy that the NLT went there. I have always wondered why they translated in a sense as like a conduct yourself in a manner worthy, since the words used there are literally about citizenship of something, and that something is not clear, or I think it's not clear, but it's interpretable. So my suggestion would be only be good citizen of the gospel of Christ. And then we can of course debate, what does gospel of Christ mean? Like, we know that the gospel means good news, but what does gospel actually mean? Um, and then I like to take Mark 1, where Jesus' ministry begins, and Jesus starts his ministry proclaiming the gospel that the kingdom of heaven is near. So I always take that part a little bit and say, okay, then how do we rephrase the sentence again? That is like, now we can say, only live as a good citizen of the kingdom of heaven, which is here right now, which means that we're a citizen, be good citizens of a kingdom that is not ours. So not the kingdom of America or the kingdom of the Netherlands, but as kin of a common that have common citizenship. And I've always been a little bit frustrated that translators took it to this obedience thing because yeah, you're right. Conduct yourself in a manner worthy sounds like you will be do what you've been told. But now if you're thinking about it now, like take your citizenship seriously, your citizenship of heaven seriously. We have different how do you say that? We have different cultures. Like if you see a Roman, which is what I think Paul is alluding to, if you see a Roman dresses a certain way, a Roman talks a certain way, they have mannerisms together, and it feels like Paul is trying to say, just like that, but then as citizens of heaven.
Yeah, I love that you're bringing that out. I think I see that a couple people in the chat also were kind of noting that. I think going back a little bit, Carolyn said like being a citizen means being part of a community, and that's a
Mhm.
neat translation. Um,
Ooh,
yeah, I really like that the NLT captures that, especially because the Greek does kind of hint at citizenship, and it's a very Roman and cultural. It's a very Roman cultural thing to like be a good citizen in a way. Um,
Yeah, that seeing that note from Yumish, like about that alternate translation, made me feel better about that part of the passage because it seems to have this implication of like, what is your allegiance to? Is your allegiance to some, like some nation or institution, or is it to, like Carolyn said, like to this community that we've chosen to belong to? And like, what if you like, sort of find your identity in that as opposed to like these different, you know, so this sort of like tribalism or nationalism that, is so often prevalent, and like, what does that look like if that's the kind of citizen you want to be?
yes. Yeah, exactly. And then I'm thinking back about the collaborative board game, which from now on, I'm going to put that in my translation. Yes, exactly. Oh, that this has to be the most active chat ever, right? So the cutoff part from Elizabeth or Lizzie says, "Oh, it's an older version of the NRSV. He was indeed so ill that he nearly died, but God had mercy on him, not only on him." Oh,
I think Lizzie a little bit later said that it was from chapter 2 actually.
oh, I
So
see. Got it. Got it. Got it.
Lizzie,
Yeah.
if you have the version from chapter 1, that verse from chapter 1, feel free to put it in the chat. I am curious.
Yes. 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 And
Um, I noticed that one thing a little bit later too, as we're catching up on the chat. Carolyn says, one of my favorite ways about thinking about God's kingdom and being a citizen of heaven is thinking about participating in God's economy where everyone is taken care of. And I
Mm,
love that. Thinking
oh,
about that it reminds me of the kingdom of heaven as, or like the idea of when in Luke we were just talking about. I think it's Luke 4. The Spirit of the Lord is upon me, for He has anointed me to proclaim good news to the oppressed, and to like declare the year of the Lord's favor. Abbreviating that, like there is an economic kind of component of it. There is a liberatory component of that. And so if that's part of what the gospel is, that's really beautiful. And I see Nettle also noted heaven culture, which
mm.
I think is really beautiful. Heaven culture. It's such a beautiful, beautiful phrase.
Yeah, I like that.
yes. Yeah,
Yeah, and
which kind of
how did that
remind
change
me.
the way we live if we think about that as the sort of like foundational culture to which we belong?
Ooh,
That's really powerful.
absolutely. When I just met Jesus, like 11 years ago, I found Jesus culture for the first time, which
Hmm.
essentially
Hmm.
is Bethel.
Yeah.
And so a lot of feelings about that right now.
Yes.
But that was the whole thing that attracted me to it in the first place. Jesus culture, like a Jesus culture, not a America culture. Not to say that we should like rebel or so, but yes, we have our own culture, a culture of like what Emery says. There's no way around it. Live together. Life together requires our best attempts to act in love towards one another, and it can be challenging, of course. But yeah, I think that kind of sums it up. I love it. Heaven culture. I think I need another tattoo.
Heaven culture, yeah. And I'm noticing that Jeannie also put in there the First Nations translation, struggling together to hold true to the good story.
Mm.
It's another wonderful way to think about it. The good story. What is good in this story? Hmm.
What?
Uh,
That is such a cool translation.
the good story is such a yeah, as a translation for gospel, I love that.
Ah, I want to read. I want to reread some New Testament stuff with that translation. That's the First Nations translation.
Oh yeah, the First Nations translation, if people have never read it, it's fantastic. And the way it like uses language, I think it opens up it like it's so creative in its like poetic nature, and it opens up new possibilities for language, and it's really beautiful. Such a beautiful thing. And I see also Lizzie is posting the translation there, from the NRS, I think that's NRSV, the older version. Um, Live your life in a manner worthy of the gospel of Christ, so that whether I come and see you or am absent and hear about you, I will know that you are standing firm in one spirit, striving side by side with one mind for the faith of the gospel, and are in no way intimidated by your opponents. Yeah,
What?
that's very similar to kind of what we were talking about earlier, the live your life in a manner worthy of the gospel. So interestingly, it kind of hides that kind of nature of citizenship there too.
I do like that part. I mean, it's verse 28 for me, not being intimidated or not being frightened in any way by your opponents. And I was wondering what y'all thought about the whole part that comes after it. This is a sign of destruction for him, but of your salvation. And this is from God. Like, is that some sort of a sideline? It's from God. It's not from me. This is from God, y'all.
Yeah, I would love to read 28 from the NLT. Don't be intimidated in any way by your enemies. This will be a sign to them that they are going to be destroyed, but that you are going to be saved even by God himself. It's such a aggressive language. And I was another thing that was kind of triggering for me when I first read it was that language of destruction and salvation. So I'm curious what everyone thinks about the idea of destruction and salvation. This imagery of major contrast here. Like, what are your thoughts there? I have some note. I did some like Greek work here, and I have some notes. But I'm curious what your like kind of people's first impressions are here.
I'm so uncomfortable with this verse. I just really, I just don't like the sort of the I don't know the confidence with which Paul is speaking about someone else's destruction and that being God's will. Just like rubs me very much the wrong way.
Yeah. Yeah, same. Because I think yeah, ESV also says destruction. The Greek says destruction. I mean, even eternal ruin can be interpreted there. Um, oh my, everything. I disagree with you here, Paul. However, if I want to give a spin to this, if I want to give a spin to this, um, it kind of makes me think of like they are missing. I'm gonna give Paul the benefit of the doubt here, right? We could also interpret it like us as the interpretive community. We could interpret it as like, hey, if you're hating on us as trans and gender expensive people, the destruction parts is that you're missing out on the fold of love that we're experiencing over and over and over again. So I don't think Paul is going there, but I'm going to choose to interpret it that way. Call me a heretic. I don't know, don't care. But it is that moment if we are good citizens of the kingdom of heaven, where we do collaborative board games together And if you don't understand this, you're missing out. You're the one that is still playing, I don't know, non-collaborative games. Like while we play D&D together, you're playing Ticket to Ride. Probably not good. I like Ticket to Ride. Anyway, but yes. And then salvation for us, because I, I just gotta say, last weekend at QCF, seeing so much queer love like compressed together, how can you live without that?
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm seeing a bunch of kind of comments in the chat. Eden says, it sounds disturbing, which I agree, Eden. I also find it sounding very disturbing.
Mhm.
And then I think Velvet says, depending on how you feel about your standing. Oh, interesting. Like, so I'm curious, would you kind of describe more what you mean by that? You mean how you feel on like how you're standing with God, or what that, yeah, what that means for you? And Carolyn says, I want to assume that it's the destruction of evil and evil practices and empire and not the people. I like the way that you're thinking about that. Yeah. Maybe the destruction of harmful ideas coming from, this is from Nettle, more than the people. And then anti 11 said, what comes to me is that when we are standing firm, that is not coming from us, but the empowerment of the Holy Spirit. Yeah, there is something about, can be like a lot of power in receiving that kind of empowerment and indwelling of God. The CEB, coming from Carolyn, CEB says, don't be afraid of anything your enemies do. Ooh, I like that. So maybe it's the actions and not their being. Yeah, that's a really powerful way to think about it. So it's very an active kind of like resisting and not being afraid and not being empowered. And Darcy, again with the First Nations translation, this will be a sign that they are coming to a bad end, but for you, it will be a sign that the Creator is setting you free. Oh,
Well,
so beautiful. I love that translation so much.
I'm like I keep like welling up every time you read part of like a passage of translation. It's like, oh, I can breathe again. Um,
um,
yeah, I really.
oh,
Oh
sorry,
yeah,
Peter, go for it.
you're still sharing from the chat. I want to hear what folks have to say.
Yeah, and then Athena says, evil people often perceive their evil being challenged as their destruction. Oh, yes, that's so
Mhm.
true. The most terrifying thing to someone trying to sell a lie is people standing up and living lives that show truth. Well
Ah,
said.
that's
That
excellent.
is incredible. And so absolutely true. Like when you think about oppression, one of the most threatening things to people who are in power is people who are living free.
Yeah.
That's beautiful.
Yeah, and,
Um,
and people like experiencing their power being taken away or no longer having the power they once had as destruction, whereas in fact maybe that is also a liberation, like an invitation to be part of that liberation.
Right, right.
Yeah, I see Athena's connecting it to transphobia. See also how terrified transphobes are of trans people being successful and happy, which I think Mish is really connected to what you're talking about the queer joy and love that we experienced at Q this weekend. It's just, how can you experience that and not feel free and not feel liberated and joyful and connected to God? It's it that in itself is there was so much beauty there.
Yes, and that happiness is seen by some as a threat,
Hmm.
right? As like, oh no, we can't have that in this nation. This is the decay of our nation. That must be terrifying to live like that. I remember.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, I really can you read that part from the First Nations translation again, Mecca Melody? How they translate salvation, like what's translated as salvation and the ones we've been reading.
Yeah, I think it was from Darcy. Yes, First Nations translation says, this will be the sign that they are coming to a bad end. But for you, it will be a sign that Creator is setting you free,
Hmm.
Yeah,
which I think is wonderful to think about for trans and gender expansive people. Like we are being set free and experiencing healing, wholeness, and salvation
hmm
in beautiful ways. that other people are sometimes unable to get behind. And that, yeah, that in itself, that fear of the unknown, the fear of like difference is in itself, that's an like imagine living in that much fear, right? So
Yes.
Yeah, I really like that reframing of the idea of salvation, like what it sort of like getting to what does salvation really mean, as opposed to like what salvation has often meant when I've heard that word used in a Christian context, especially when it's set in juxtaposition with destruction, like you can be destroyed or you can be saved, and like how again that language is often really weaponized. But like to turn it completely on its head, which I think that translation is doing, and a lot of people commenting in the chat are also doing. Um,
Yeah.
when you think about that as being set free, and like the threat that that often poses to people who are not willing to accept that freedom as freedom.
yeah, to pull a little bit from the Greek, because I was looking into the idea of destruction and salvation. So destruction in the Greek is apoleia, which is like loss or ruin, or yeah, there is a sense of like loss attributed to it. And so as we're talking about this idea of what are people missing out on, the kind of the loss that's there, I think that we can see that in there. And salvation is soteria, which is connected to sozo, which is the like to save. But like in the context of, it's not just like we think, especially in like Christian doctrine, it's often like this idea of salvation after death, right? And yet sozo is a holistic salvation. It also is, in like in extra biblical literature, the language of soteria is often used kind of talking about bodily health, welfare, deliverance, victory, recovery after illness, or so there's a lot of embodied nature of that. And when we think about that in the Christian kind of perspective, it's taken like out. And I think also I think sometimes it can be we actually abandon those kind of embodied natures of salvation, um, and just only focus on the kind of the spiritual salvation from sin as like, at least that was my upbringing. Salvation was very much like, do you want to go to heaven when you die? That's what salvation is, not, as I like to call it, like lifeboat theology of like believing in God just to get on a lifeboat to like, go to heaven and to avoid that. But what does salvation mean in the embodied sense? As like trans
Right.
people, I feel more whole in my body this way,
Yeah.
as I am, and that is sozo to me. So I just love thinking about it that way.
Yeah. No, thanks for sharing that because it's been a theology, I guess, as a Jew that has bothered me, where Jews don't focus on afterlife. Like a small background, Jews essentially say, for those who don't know and are watching, I'm Jewish. Um, Jews essentially say if we talk about the afterlife, we then automatically also talk about who goes to the afterlife, which then automatically means we are judges. So
Mm.
we don't talk about the afterlife, period.
Hmm.
So it's not like Jews don't believe in the afterlife, but there's no like complex eschatology like Christians have. And it has bothered me for a long time after I met Jesus in 2011 that there was such a focus on that salvation, meaning you're going to heaven. Like, is that truly the gift of salvation? That's we're going to heaven. But what about the rest? What about today? Um, yeah, that's very hard. That's very hard. I hear my kids giggle, so I'm like, are they gonna come in?
I just want to note something well before we move on from this conversation about salvation. I see this in the chat. Velvet Video wrote, yes, with God, I am currently torn between two schools of thought and two churches, one of which shun me for living an openly sinful a life by simply continuing to exist in my trans lifestyle. It makes me question salvation, like I'm deluding myself. And I think I I first of all, I just want to say I hear that, and I resonate with that as someone who grew up in a very similar church where that was the case. And I think while we're talking about this idea of salvation, I hope that like as you're hearing, and maybe this is an opening of like new possibilities of what salvation means. And I think that as we are trans and gender expansive people, and first and foremost, we are loved by God, not in spite of like who we are, but in the fullness of who we are. And I think, those are those things. It can be really hard when our churches and our spiritual communities are not seeing that too. And so I just wanted to acknowledge that. I saw your comment, and absolutely, I think you are first and foremost, like you and all of us here, like we are loved by God first and foremost. And I think that's the biggest thing to, as we're having these conversations around salvation. It's a complex thing.
Absolutely. Absolutely. We can build God's economy and kingdom here. I
Mm,
like I like what Carolyn says there,
yeah.
because that's it, right? Salvation, again, coming back to that salvation. So resonate with it as well, Velvet. Oof.
Yeah.
That's not what it's about. I just refuse to believe that. I believe that salvation is exactly what you said earlier, Melody, where we can be our true self, like transitioning literally has been salvation for me.
Yeah. Flourishing.
Mhm.
Well, I think Mish has kids coming into the room and to come say hello. So I think she'll be off camera for a little bit. Um, but I'm curious, as we're kind of coming near the end of our time. We still have a couple more verses to read through. Um, I am curious in the hello. Oh, hello. We have visitors. Um,
They want to say hi,
hello.
but they should be in
Hello.
bed, right?
It's good to see you. I hope that you sleep well. And I am sure everyone currently watching online is also wishing you a good night's sleep. This is really sweet.
Yeah.
Bye. Aw, we're getting a bunch of people also on the chat saying hello. Very cute. Well, that was a wonderful surprise. Thank you for that.
I heard them stomping. I'm like, oh my everything.
I just want to be part of things.
Yes. Well, I was thinking as you were like welcoming them in to the space, like we have about 10 minutes left and we still have two more verses. Like it's
Oh
crazy how
my
much
everything.
we've spent on just like these two first verses. Yeah, should we move on to those and at least talk a little bit about the idea of suffering?
Yes. Hardcore. Let's go. Do you want to read a verse, Peter?
Sure. We're on just 29, or should I go ahead and read 29 through 30?
Yeah, let's do 29 and 30 since I think it's similar in the context.
Great. For he has graciously granted you the privilege not only of believing in Christ, but of suffering for him as well, since you are having the same struggle that you saw I had, and now hear that I still have.
That's so much shorter than the NLT. I was just like, whoa, we're yeah, NLT is a lot longer, but I also really like 30. We are in this struggle together. You have
Mm.
seen my struggle in the past and you know that I am still in the midst of it. So I'm curious what people are what are your all thoughts on the idea of struggle and the way that Paul talks about struggle and suffering.
This
This
is
is like,
again one of those things that has been triggering might not be the right word, but just this point of contention with Christian mindset, if that makes sense, where where yes, I grew up Jewish, but before we moved to Israel and lived there, and I went to Jewish Orthodox school, I was born in a Pentecostal commune. So my parents are extremely Pentecostal. And don't get me wrong, I love me a good Pentecostal worship session, but uh the suffering part, whew, that has always scared the crap out of me. It was always like, hey, um, what do you think? What do you think if somebody tells me that I have to deny Jesus? And then my parents would say, you can never deny Jesus. That is the biggest sin ever. You need to suffer. And they would always share these stories about the persecuted church and oh my everything. I just don't know. I didn't know then what to think about it, and I definitely have no clue what to think about it now. So I'm very curious. This is just my first initial thoughts about suffering. Of course, I can do again a metaphorical interpretation of it, like we did with verse 28. But I'm curious. I'm curious to hear your thoughts and the people at home, their thoughts about how can we interpret suffering for Jesus.
Yeah, this was for me too. This was another part of this passage that I had a really kind of gut negative response to. I think the idea of suffering specifically has been used in really harmful ways in my experience, and just sort of this message that the more you're suffering, the holier you get. The closer you are to God, the more you are following in the footsteps of Jesus. Like that's defined by suffering. And that suffering is kind of like holy in itself or salvific in itself. Um, so that immediately sort of like brought up that framework to me. But then, Micah Melody, you had this quote from the Queer Bible Commentary that I think kind of framed it in a different way that was really interesting to me.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah, this is from Justin Sapiatanis. This quote is not necessarily about this particular passage, but Justin Sapiatanis um, wrote the commentary for the book of Philippians, and so talks about suffering. Specifically, this is about chapter 3, verses 10 through 11, but I think it's applicable here as well. Um, he writes, we should be careful of the concept of sharing in Christ's suffering that Paul notes here in Philippians chapter 3, verses 10 through 11. This passage has been misused to encourage people to remain with abusive spouses, to justify enforced celibacy for gay people who are allowed in quotes by their churches to be gay but not avowed and practicing homosexuals, and to tell transgender people that they should not transition as opportunities to relate to Christ's suffering. Yet Christ's suffering is not a goal to be mimicked or a condition to be maintained. It is the result of human systems of oppression. The useful part of identifying with Christ's suffering is knowing that when we are faced with hardship, God knows the experience and is present with us in the reality of pain. But that does not mean that it is to be encouraged. And I really like that because I think, and this is why I find, and so many oppressed peoples and peoples who have experienced massive harm and oppression, and so many of the liberation theologies that have emerged out of Black liberation theology that's emerged out of the global South, like those theologies, at a core part is the idea of God standing on the side of the oppressed and this identification with the oppressed and this allyship and also not just allyship but deep understanding as someone who has suffered, as a God who has suffered. It's encouraging and it gives me hope. And thinking as trans and gender expansive people, our suffering that we experience, the striving, the struggle for liberation and for freedom, God is in that with us, I think is a really encouraging thing. I'm also seeing a lot of stuff in the chat here.
Yeah,
This is
exactly.
Misha. Do you want to read some of those from the chat? I see you kind of like looking.
I was looking through it. Yeah, definitely. Like Carolyn said, I like struggle better than suffering.
Mm.
As like when I've suffered, there are people we say this is all part of God's plan
mhm.
and will be used for good. Um, And then Song Morning says, I love putting a new framework and even holiness to suffering. Not that it's good in itself, but that we can reframe what we suffer as partaking in Christ's experience.
Mm.
And then I think of Saint Francis and the stigmata. Ooh. And then sounds like college fraternity initiation. That is very American for the record. I mean, not that hazing does not happen in the Netherlands, but not as much as America. Sheesh. Uh, Sometimes it feels like suffering the church gets used to justify preventable suffering and terrible
Uh,
treatment like poverty or abuse, right?
Absolutely, yes.
And Eden, you're definitely spot on here. Yeah, that's kind of like how I think about it too, Eden. I think that suffering is something we're going to experience. And so I guess it's helpful to think about having a community that's also struggling and understands, like being part of a trans community. But we don't need to add suffering,
Hmm.
like it's true in many evangelical spaces. Absolutely. I mean, the last 2.5 years transitioning and the parts that come along in my transition journey, yeah, sometimes you can view some parts as suffering. And I'm not talking about trans hate, I'm talking about the euphoric things. Fill in the blanks there yourself. We're live. But that's definitely something that we can connect over. I really like that interpretation. Oh, Amory just says truth. Good stuff. I see Jenny says, I see that suffering as more of an encouragement to those at the time already suffering, like what you say, Melody, with global South and liberation theology. Yeah, what is that whole thing with that? Where did that idea come from of encouraging people to suffer? Like you have to find suffering, like you have to abstain, or even certain sects within ancient traditions that's literally suffered or went on to live in a desert by themselves. That is an interesting. I would like somebody is if somebody is doing that doctoral work, research that. Oof.
And I noticed too, a little bit, Velvet says, as a homeless person, the suffering isn't hard to imagine, though if you've seen the Passion of the Christ movie, it always strikes me as beyond our comprehension. Also, the fate of most apostles and many prophets does scare me. Like, we are never promised we won't go through extremes. Um, yes. And I think as we're talking about this, the idea of we as we stand together, and I think about this and as a trans and gender expansive context, as we stand and like fight for justice and like for liberation for people, there are going to be hard things because that's the nature of when you push back against a system that is trying to maintain power and control. There is going to be that we're going to get the backlash, we're going to get the violence and the hate and the oppression, and that can be a lot, that can be scary. And also, again, one of the things that there's again and again I noticed in this passage is the idea of togetherness, community. We are striving together, we are struggling together, we are standing together. And I think that is encouraging, that we are not doing this alone, we don't have to face this alone. I think I like the NLT in verse 30, we are in this struggle together, is what how they translate Paul's words there. And I think I find hope in that.
Absolutely. Cool. I think this conversation needs to continue. Do we? I should know this. Do we have a Discord channel, a BSL Discord channel?
We have a Bible study Discord channel. Not specifically for Bible Study Live, but we do have a channel in our Discord for Bible study. We actually used to do our Bible study on Discord in that area before we started
Hey.
back up in Bible Study Live. But yes, I absolutely think that this is a wonderful conversation. And look how much conversation we've had with these 4 verses. It's incredible.
Oh my everything. I feel like Thank you so much, people at home. Like, I love all the engagement, and there's so much things for me to think about now. And thanks for saying hi to my kids as well.
That was really sweet.
Any last words because before I do some announcements, Melody or Peter?
I think that for me, one of the key takeaways is the idea of being together and doing this together.
Boom.
Yeah, I had that gut feeling of like, oh my God, it's so individual, or like there's this, and that the idea of the we have to, we have to live a life worthy of the gospel in a very individual context, but yet all of this is all about in community, and we are working together to build a better, like, was it Nettle said, heaven culture, to embody heaven culture, and
Yeah.
I love that. So thinking about the togetherness is where I'm kind of
Yeah.
what I'm taking from this.
Yes.
Yeah, I think I'm still going to be chewing on sort of reframing of salvation that we talked about, sort of the things that you brought to light there, Micah Melody, and then also some of the things that people in the chat were bringing up in terms of how we can sort of turn that on its head a little bit or expand our notion of what salvation means, to think about it in that sort of liberatory context. It's really
Yes.
great conversation around that.
Oh, that is so good. I think my key takeaway is like, yeah, reframing it as a collaborative board game. I can't get away from that analogy, but also think about it, how perfect, right? Because there's rules in a game, but they are not restrictive. They are liberating. Like if you don't play according to the rules, it's just like, I mean, why do you even join the game? The rules are there to make the game fun, not to restrict it. So I think I can't get away. That's what I'm just gonna like reread the entire Philippians with a board game, a collaborative board game in my mind, and see where it ends. Ah, yes. All right, so next, I only have one announcement. Next Bible Study Live is February 21st, am I right?
Mhm.
So I hope to see y'all again. A quick sneak preview. I'm going to try to edit this and turn it into a podcast so we can listen to it as well. So be looking forward to that. I hope to have that done next week. Uh, that's it. That's all I have to say.
Thank you, everyone. And also thank you so much for all the amazing comments in the chat. This was yeah, amazing
Yes,
conversation.
absolutely, absolutely. Sweet.
All right.
Epic. Yes.
We'll see you next month. Bye,
See you
everyone.
next month. Bye bye.